Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube. I'm Charlotte Gallagher, and joining me today is the BBC's North America correspondent, Anthony Zerka, who's in Washington. And Anthony, you've been travelling around with President Trump for the last couple of days, and what a few days it's been.
Yeah, it's definitely been a wild ride. It started on Friday with the president and the press pool I was part of departing Washington, D.C. on Air Force One to fly down to his resort in southern Florida at Mar-a-Lago. And he talked to the press on the South Lawn of the White House before he departed and said that the United States was winning the Iran war, that they wanted a deal. In the middle of the flight, some press assistants came back with a Truth Social post that Donald Trump had written saying that the war was winding down and kind of a bullet point of things that he said were the objectives for the U.S. in that war, implying that the United States was meeting all of them. And on Monday morning, he had another Truth Social post, this time saying that there were negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, and he was doing away with that 48-hour deadline and extending it another 5 days. That they were making progress in these negotiations. He said that he thought Iran wanted a deal, he thought the U.S. wanted a deal, and that they agreed on many of the points of contention. So it was quite a roller coaster ride.
Does he have a strategy? Because it seems so confusing, and these posts and then his speeches, they all kind of contradict each other.
Yeah, and that's kind of Donald Trump's negotiating style, is to make big threats and be unpredictable. And I guess it's worked for him in the real estate world. It's certainly, he views it as the art of the deal, this kind of developed negotiating strategy that he has. And on Monday morning, as we were getting ready to leave South Florida, he came over and spoke to those of us in the press pool on the tarmac, and he said the one thing he knows how to do is make deals. And then we got on a flight and flew to Tennessee for a totally unrelated trip that Donald Trump was going on, where he was talking about domestic crime fighting policy, and then made a trip to Graceland, Elvis's home, historic home, where he signed a guitar and toured Elvis's kind of kitschy 1970s house. And so that may be part of the strategy, to say, okay, yes, this is serious, but I'm still following my routine, and Americans shouldn't be worried about this somehow spinning out of control. Although, when we were driving back and forth from Donald Trump's golf course in Palm Beach, Florida, we would go right by gas stations, and I was looking at the price of a gallon of gas, and it was pushing towards $4 a gallon, which is a lot. And I think Americans are feeling that, and that at least is a very tangible kind of change that has happened since Donald Trump launched this war, and it really is hitting Americans where they feel it in their pocketbooks.
And he'll be worried about that, considering he campaigned saying, I will make your life better, things will be cheaper. But if things are getting more expensive, even his core base are going to get annoyed.
It definitely is a drag on his popularity. When I talk to people in his base, and I was just in Texas a few weeks ago talking to some diehard Trump supporters, and they're willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. They say, well, he promised not to get us involved in forever wars, to get us entangled in the Middle East. And so, I trust him to find a way out of this. We'll see how far that trust goes, if this does stretch on more, if they're going to start getting frustrated. But it is taking a toll. This war is taking a toll on Trump among independent voters. Obviously, Democrats have been against him from the beginning, but if you look at the approval of his handling of the economy, it's at some of his lowest numbers he's had in his second term. And the gas prices, one of the most obvious signs that his promises of lowering prices at the gas pump, at the grocery store, for housing, those have not been fulfilled.
Do you think he's at a bit of a crossroads then at this point? He needs to get out of this war. Iran are also saying that these talks are fake news, and he's thinking very much about the midterms in November.
Yeah, I think Republicans are very worried. I think they can read a poll as well as those of us in the media can, and they see that the voters are unhappy, they're concerned, they don't think the country's going in the right direction. It seems like Donald Trump is looking for an off-ramp, although there are forces pulling him in both ways. I mean, he is making these ultimatums, and Iran doesn't seem to be cooperating. And if Iran continues to to be reluctant to reach some sort of a deal or capitulation, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Trump to keep pushing ahead, to not end this war with the current regime in place, to not end this war with Iran still threatening and controlling the Strait of Hormuz. So this week, I think, could very well prove to be a pivot point. Do these negotiations actually happen? Do they move forward? Is there some sort of a resolution, an off-ramp that will satisfy the Iran hawks in Trump's administration and let him kind of extricate himself gracefully? Or does it look like another impasse, and then Donald Trump has to decide, do you just declare victory despite not having signs of victory and go home, or do you push ahead and escalate, which talks about using ground forces to secure the Strait of Hormuz, or talks about using the Marines who are on the way to the Gulf to secure Karg Island and Iranian oil. That obviously would be a dramatic escalation.
Could we reach a situation where President Trump walks away? And I know there's this expression, taco, Trump always chickens out, which I don't think he'll like, but could we get to that situation?
He could decide to declare victory and head home. The thing is, even though Trump will sometimes back down from ultimatums he sets, he backs away from these dramatic positions he stakes out, he seldom totally abandons them. Yes, he backed away from tariffs, but then he imposed them again, and he had tariffs that were much higher than they were at the beginning of his administration. Even though he chickened out, he came back and persisted, although the Supreme Court has taken a big bite out of that. But I think it does show that Trump is willing to back away. Trump is willing to pull away from a confrontation that he thinks isn't going his way, but he doesn't totally disappear. And so if the United States takes a step back here in this Iran war, there's no guarantee that the United States is just packing up and going home entirely. I think you'd have to keep watching to see what happens next.
And what do you make of these reports that JD Vance will be involved in the negotiations? Because he's not been very visible at all during this.
No, he's kind of kept his head down. But of course, part of his brand was criticizing this kind of interventionist foreign policy. He served in the Marines and served overseas during wartime, so he kind of has experience with that, and he cites it as one of the reasons why he doesn't think the United States should get bogged down in forever wars, bogged down in fighting in the Middle East when direct American national security concerns aren't at stake. He has towed the administration line in very limited public appearances, just enough to keep the rumors flying that he's been sidelined, that he is objecting, kind of keep those rumors at bay for the most part. But if he does take a much more visible role in these negotiations, I think it suggests that the Trump administration wants to get out of this, that they're putting someone who has a reputation as being averse to extended conflicts in charge of negotiations, that they're taking this seriously. It also, puts JD Vance's reputation on the line. He can only dodge this issue for so long, and then if he's the point negotiator, he is going to take a lot of the blame if things go sideways. Now, he may take the blame anyway. I mean, he's tied at the hip to this administration, and he does clearly have 2028 presidential ambitions. So it's in his interest to try to resolve this, to not have it hanging over his head when he starts to gear up his presidential campaign. And of course, not to crash the global economy, because a bad economy and a bad American economy is poison for an incumbent administration. It could derail his presidential ambitions before they even get started.
What could President Trump paint as a victory at this point? Because it doesn't appear that there's going to be regime change in Iran, or at least radical regime change. This isn't Venezuela. It's very different. What could he paint as a victory to his base?
Yeah, and you notice he hasn't been talking about regime change much at all. I mean, he did say on Monday he envisions some kind of regime change, some kind of new regime coming in, but he certainly doesn't talk about the Iranian people rising up in revolt right now. He doesn't talk about how he wants to have a role in picking the next leader of Iran. And he doesn't talk about unconditional surrender, which is a term he used very early in this war. So if you put aside the idea of regime change, that this is not something that the United States is going to get out of this, it almost feels like what what he wants now is to be able to say that Iran's military has been degraded, which it has. Iran's military infrastructure has been destroyed, which all evidence is that it has been greatly debilitated. Iran abandoning its nuclear weapons program, which that seems to be at the heart of some of these back-channel negotiations for the moment, and then guarantees of security in the Strait of Hormuz, which if he can say that the strait is secure, that global shipping is passing through again, that things are returning to normal, then I think he could probably start to withdraw American forces and declare some modicum of victory. Although safe passage in the Strait of Hormuz was something that was the way things were before this war started. So it almost is the central feature of these negotiations is to kind of get back to the way things were before all of this began about a month ago.
And I suppose you could end up with a situation where the US does retreat from this, but then you've still got Israel perhaps going into Lebanon, a ground invasion there. And also you've got the Gulf states that are very unhappy that they've been dragged into it. It's so much more than the US at this point.
Yeah, that's kind of the wild card. And there's been signs of tension between the United States and Israel, signs of different ultimate goals in this operation between the U.S. and Israel. And Donald Trump had a phone conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, on Monday. We haven't gotten a whole lot of details of how that conversation proceeded, but the negotiations with Iran is one thing. The negotiations with Israel is another one, and then, as you mentioned, placating the Gulf Arab allies of the United States is also going to be a delicate dance because they got pulled into this. They are suffering pretty significant economic hardship, but there are factions within the Gulf allies that want some sort of a more conclusive resolution to this.
That was the BBC's Anthony Zerka in Washington. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast on YouTube, click the link below.